pollution globally, India used to produce before the industrialization about 25% of global output, which is well documented. Is that clear?
Yeah,
Yes.
it's clear.
Okay, so and starting from there, when the British were done with us, we were producing 3% of the global output, which is well documented again. Now, over the last 73 years after independence, the share of manufacturing in GDP has increased from 10% at the time of independence to about 16% now. It peaked in 1995 at 18%. But globally, surprisingly, and not many people know this for some reason, is that the global manufacturing, on the global manufacturing scorecard, India's output is still 3%, which it was at the time of independence. So this is our attempt to help the audiences understand how important and crucial this topic is, not only to India's manufacturing, but to India's economy as well as global manufacturing output. So with that context, I'll put the first question to Magesh to set the context right as to why is industrialization important to an economy, and especially an economy like India. Magesh.
Sure. So thank you very much, Anand. It's a pleasure to be with you as well as the audience and Deepak San here. And what we want to start off with is understanding, what manufacturing really has contributed so far. Is my own case. I started my career here in India with Bosch in '98 when I joined Bosch on campus, and if Bosch did not invest in a manufacturing facility and providing technologies since 1954 to Motor Industries Company Limited, then where would people like us get an opportunity to get world-class global management education training, and then use that to develop our own lives, our own families, and contribute back to the societies that we operate in. So I firmly believe that manufacturing, businesses that I worked for, starting from Bosch, then Black & Decker, Sony Corporation, HCL Technologies was my stint in services and software technology business, but customers were manufacturing. And now back to the automotive industry with WAPCO, which is again a manufacturing enterprise global. So my learning has been that manufacturing jobs provide a lot of stability. People typically join as trainees, either on the shop floor or as management graduates, and then they have an opportunity to work all the way up for 20, 25, 30 years, and have their career both inside India as well as globally today. If they enter a manufacturing organization. So this has been the case for a majority of people of my generation, born in the 70s, so to speak. Now let's understand very briefly the historical perspective, right? So all of recorded history, as it is recorded by the Western civilization, starts off industrialization starts off somewhere in the 18th century, and moving from muscle-based energy, that is human muscle as well as animal muscle-based energy, people created mechanical devices, mechanical machines, which were predominantly being operated by hand or by using animal muscle power. And then that transitioned into with the discovery of steam and the power of steam and steam engines. That got translated into a lot more efficient way of moving things and manufacturing things, and that brings us to the first revolution in the industrial age, and that is the steam invention and application of the steam engine and the power of steam. And then moving along in the latter part of the 18th century and early 19th century, the advent of electricity spurred on to the Industrial Revolution 2.0, so to speak, where machines were powered by the power of electricity, and electricity was being powered or being generated by either through the power of hydroelectricity or burning coal and creating steam, and then that driving thermal energy and electricity, so on and so forth. And then finally, later on in the 20th century, we had the advent of electronics, and then we had machines that can be programmed, and therefore you had PLC logic, you had CNC machines, and you had machines which efficiencies improved by many degrees, and automation was also arriving in that scene, and that is Industry 3.0. And before the turn of the century, when Bill Clinton signed commercialization of the public internet way back in 1998, and internet became available, then manufacturing and devices began to start connecting to the internet, and then you had the age of intelligence, and now we live in Industry 4.0. So that's the kind of landscape that we have traversed over the last 250 years, at least as documented by Western civilization. There's a whole lot of things that were, of course, happening in India even before the British came. In China, in Japan, there were a lot of technologies which were domestic to these countries. There was a whole lot of advancement. People had very unique techniques of making use of things available in nature, raw materials available in nature, and then producing things out of that using their ingenuity even before the British arrived to India. Okay. So that's what I would give as a opening statement with regards to the history of industrialization for this discussion.
Okay. Is my voice a little better now? Or is it still distant?
It's clear.
Very clear. Great. That's a relief. I apologize again. Deepak San, as Magesh so eloquently illustrated the entire history from the industrialization, and he set the context right. Deepak San, I would request you from a Japanese perspective, in the sense that there is one history of industrial revolution which starts in Europe and the UK. And at the time these things were happening in the UK in the 18th century and the 19th century, what was happening in Japan? Can you take us through that journey as to how they woke up? And to start this journey, this is a very fascinating story which not many people in India are aware of Commodore Perry, who suddenly appears on the shores of Japan, heading a big fleet. And at that time, Japan was really isolated and inward looking.
Yeah.
And then suddenly they realize how far behind they are in technology, and that started a process of Meiji restoration. So can you give us that historical perspective?
Yes, thank you, Anandji, for introduction. Again, just to brief about me, I work for an organization called JETRO, and I have been involved in Indo-Japan relations for more than past 20 years. So we primarily work for promoting the investment of Japanese companies in India, and also helping Indian companies to get into the Japanese market. And we are also partially involved in policy making. We work very closely with the local government. So I'll also, at the later part of the discussion, I'll also touch upon the policy level things. But as you set the context about the Japanese history of industrialization, so it was initially more to do with the political scenario prevailing at that point of time. As you said, can you hear me?
Okay. Sorry about that.
Yeah. So, as you said, that Japan was an island country and it was completely detached from the outside world. But in 18th century, after the industrialization happened in European countries, they also started expanding their territories, and they started making colonies. So, and they had reached up to Asia and other countries. So Japan, at the same time, after being involved in all these global prevailing scenarios, there's some political changes happened, because Japan, earlier it used to be a samurai-based clan system who were controlling the country, and it was very traditional economy. It was based on agriculture only. But in due course of time, when the political change happened, and after the colonization of European countries started, Japan also started realizing that they have to build a military might, and in order to withstand against the colonization of European countries. And that is when the Meiji took over the Japanese administration. And that phase, we call it as, it happened in 1868, and that is called as Meiji Restoration. And that was the first phase of nationalism, feeling of nationalism happened in Japan. And based upon the prevailing political scenario, they thought that they should build a modern army, and hence they have to start making the defense equipment, all the defense supplies in-house. And that's how the first industrial revolution happened in Japan. So this continued till the World War II, and the local manufacturing was primarily targeted to supply the needs of the local army. But as you all know, after the World War II, Japan was brought down to their knees. But Japanese, somehow, I think, human race wise, they are very strong people mentally, because they are they have born in such kind of environment where every day you have to overcome somewhere volcanic eruptions will happen, sometime earthquake will happen, and it's not very favorable condition to live. So mentally they are very strong by born as a human race. So even after the World War II setback, that didn't determine, didn't they were not demoralized after the setback. And again, the nationalism wave 2 happened, and that was more in terms of building our nation again, to make ourselves more significant globally. And at that point of time, the Japanese policymakers, they decided that we have to be economic superpower like America is. And hence, in order to become the economic superpower, we have to focus on our economic policy. And then they realized that they cannot be stronger in agriculture, because it's a mountainous country, and 75% of the country is mountain. So agricultural land is not available in adequate manner. So then that prompted them to move towards manufacturing. And that is when the manufacturing revolution 2.0 started in Japan. Initially, they focused on two primary technologies. The first one was mobility. The another one was communication. So communication was basically driven by the electronic segment. So that's how in due course of time, almost 40 to 50 years, they established themselves as a global hub for manufacturing giving the mobility solution and also the electronic solution. So this is the part 2 of the Japanese industrial revolution. So I'll pass on to Anand if you want to know further about this.
Sure. So, am I audible now?
Yes.
Okay. So, the thing about Japan, as you so rightly pointed out, was that because of their cultural moorings and the fact that they, are their geographical, environmental conditions impel them to be able to be self-sufficient and to be able to be a superpower because of their conditions. So these are the conditions that drive them to be self-sufficient and to be a global powerhouse. But for India, what are the conditions? If you bring that perspective to India, and I'll come to Magesh for this, is the reason that, or what is the reason why Indian manufacturing development has been subdued during the last so many years? That's a very simple question with a very in-depth answer that needs to be had. And Magesh, what's your view on that?
So, in my analysis, over the last working in the corporate world for 22 years, what I've understood is that, for any organization or any endeavor or any country to be successful, the primary ask, or the step one, is to have a very strong foundation in a overall comprehensive vision, which is long term, and this vision, which is formulated by a nation or an organization, has to be based on some very sound values, universal values. It should, it should be inclusive in nature. It should include everybody from every strata of society, their well-being, and it should have a complete uh, addressing of the value chain of value creation. So it should be end to end. So a vision uh, should be created, first of all. And this vision should be long term. It should be comprehensive, and it should be based on the Indian value system, because India is the spiritual capital of the world. It has always been, it will always will be the spiritual capital. So there is a lot that we can offer. Now, in the last 73 years, while we have been, a democratic republic and trying to find our place in the world, liberalization of India only started in 91, which is relatively a very, very short period in time when you look at world history, right? And if you study industrial revolutions across the continents that exist on planet Earth, you will find that all of these revolutions were not perfect. They were far from being perfect. They were all very small, incremental contributions by individuals, by pioneers in their own constraints, and they fought against the current regime. They fought against the current challenges of their times in order to create what today we enjoy and most often take for granted as inventions and innovations and conveniences that we have in our life. So going back to the point of vision, I think India did a fantastic job immediately after independence in launching the Green Revolution, and thereafter launching the White Revolution, launching the 5-year planning commission, and then executing industrialization. All of that, the entire steam and the fervor which the young nation took on change was phenomenal. Keeping in mind that everything in India was depleted. But now, what is really required, now that we have 1.3 billion people, the Indian mindset, the Indian brain, the Indian spirituality, the Indian value system, this is global, right? We have given yoga to the world. We have a World Yoga Day. So with the mindset that we have now, what can we contribute and make sure that India will sustain its progress? It's extremely important to have an industrialization vision for India, which is long term. Long term means 50 years, 100 years. That is the time horizon in which you can build a nation. And that time horizon means the vision has to be comprehensive. It should take care of our existing reality. What is our current reality and where do we want to go? And then we can use the analysis and the learnings from what has been already provided to us from, let's say, the Japanese, the Germans, people from the United Kingdom, North of America, Russia, all of our trading partners. There is a huge amount of learning on how they successfully achieved the industrial revolution at a peak and descended from it slowly. So at the moment, they're descending from their peak, whereas India is rising. But it needs to be bolstered with a very strong vision and extremely precise execution and strategic thinkers, strategic leaders who are available for leadership and execution at every level within the administration of India, as well as within the execution of the corporate world. And together, we need to create a public-private partnership in formulating this vision as well as executing it on a day-to-day basis, on a yearly basis, and make sure things are coherent and comprehensive and are serving a particular vision, not just have a very short term or a medium term or even a very, very mission-oriented development activities in some pockets of India. So that kind of approach, I think, is not the need of the hour. We need to collaborate, work together, and make sure things are moving forward rather than oscillating from improvement and then slacking and then improvement and then slacking, which is what we are seeing in the last few decades since our independence.
Brilliantly put. Thank you, Magesh. Um, and that you addressed two parts. That question in two parts. One is that how was the journey so far, and going forward, how it needs to be steered. And these two parts we are going to explore in depth because they go far deeper into, as you rightly pointed out, how the leadership is done, the environment of innovation in our country, the education, the formulating of a vision. So we need to explore these points in depth. I'll go to Deepak San. Deepak San, can you tell us from your perspective, from a Japanese perspective, or rather a global perspective, as to how do you see the journey, India's journey in the last 73 years? What has gone right and what has not gone so right? And how do we need to move forward from here to set a context?
Yeah. See, as Magesh rightly said, that we have to bring everything into consideration. And what is the reality in case of India? And if we see where we are now, we have been primarily developed as a service-based economy. So the share of services sector to the GDP is 70%. And again, if we go to primary sector, which is predominantly agriculture, its share into economy is hardly 14%. So, and almost 70% of our population is involved in primary sector. So in both cases, we have two challenges. I'm just talking about the current scenario. First, how we increase the productivity of the primary sector, because 70% population is dependent on that. And nowadays, there is a trend that per farming family wise, land holding of each farming family is reducing day by day, because we are in fourth or fifth generation after the independence. So how you increase the productivity of the agriculture, that is one challenge. The another challenge is the services sector, uh, which contributes 70% of our economy. How we make it more sustainable, because service sector, if I say, it's primarily, I believe it is IT sector, and mostly you are depending upon the demand from US and European market, but parallelly our domestic demand is also increasing. So in long term vision, how we can make a sustainable demand for service sector, that is another challenge. And when you get deep into these factors, we don't have any bandwidth available with the primary sector and secondary sector, because majority of the activities are already involved, and we have almost reached to a stage of stagnation, I believe. Then we only bandwidth is left with the manufacturing sector. And Japan is the live example that they started focusing on innovation driven manufacturing, which was primarily led by mobility and electronics. Uh, in 40-50 years, they increased the manufacturing percentage to the GDP up to 30%. And as an outcome, what happened? Now Japan is job surplus country. That is another factor, that population is decreasing, but they created a hell lot of job due to the manufacturing. That is one example. When they raise their level of manufacturing percentage to GDP up to 30%, then it also impacted the life of Japanese citizens, because now they had regular job, and there was no scope to there was no scope to grow the primary sector beyond a certain points. So obviously they had to focus on manufacturing. So it ensured them that all the Japanese citizens have basic essentials of their life fulfilled. When I say basic essentials, it means that shelter, food, clothes, and also the healthcare and education. So in our country, the basic essentials of life are only shelter, food, and clothes. But in Japan, healthcare and education is also included as a essential services to the citizen. So that is a huge difference. So I think we have to work something on this level in terms of policy. as far as manufacturing sector is concerned, unfortunately, we have all the resources available, which requires to be a global manufacturing hub, whether it is natural resources, whether it is human resources, where it is knowledgeable resource. But I don't know, something wrong with the policy, or policy is there, but implementation is bad. So it's a deep subject to discuss. But what I want to say that India primarily, once the economy become free in after, I believe it was 1990, when our economy was open up. So India projected itself as a service-based economy. Some
Yes,
sort of
it's
jobs,
a big
some
reason.
sort of
Yes,
assignments we received from the US and European countries,
yes,
and we projected ourselves as a service-based economy. So I think that was little bit late from the policy making point of view. And it was only in 2012 when Indian government first time become very serious about the manufacturing activity, and the national manufacturing policy was announced by the Manmohan Singh government, which turned out to be the Make in India campaign during the Modi regime. Now the challenge for us uh, ahead is that how we sustain our primary sector and tertiary sector. Only manufacturing has bandwidth to grow, and in order to do so, we have to somehow increase our share of manufacturing activity into GDP at least up to 25%. That is what our manufacturing policy says. And as per the calculation of our experts, if you increase the share of manufacturing to GDP by 1%, you are able to create 10 million jobs.
wow,
And
wow,
especially for country like ours, it is
yes,
the implementation has to be very important. So
absolutely.
we Japanese, from the point of view of Japanese, we still feel that India is not R&D driven economy, because for manufacturing you require innovation, you require R&D, but we feel India is just a service based economy. So obviously there are many Japanese automobile makers. They came to India, they established their plant, and except Maruti Suzuki, I don't think any other Japanese company are involved in R&D segment in automotive, which is the last stage. So I think we have to reverse the trend. We have to make it R&D based manufacturing, rather than manufacturing started with CKD and just an assembly, and then in due course of time, if market grows, then companies will set up the R&D. So we have to reverse this trend, and that is where I think a lot needs to be done by the Indian government.
Thank you, Deepak sir. Yeah, that was really very illuminating and brought to focus what exactly are the areas where we need to work. Now, you spoke about innovation, you spoke about R&D. Now, as a journalist, before I go to Magesh, I think it's very important for me to share that, see, in the last 20 plus years that I've been attending events and conferences and speaking to industry stakeholders, uh, obviously there are people are aware of what are the areas that are lacking, like innovation and employability, for example, a culture for manufacturing. But things have remained the same. And that is also a need for a discussion like these with you gentlemen, is that what at the basic level, for example, I was speaking to a German manufacturer and I expressed the same thing, that from an outsider's perspective, what is your view? Why we've not been able to progress so far despite us, uh, being so studious and knowledgeable and a stream of consciousness that goes back thousands of years. So he said, Anand, we can give you all the technology that we have, but we cannot transfer our culture to you, our innovation, culture of innovation to you. That is something that you will have to inculcate. So these are very fundamental points that we need to explore as to why these things have not found an environment to grow or a fertile ground in India. Things like innovation, leadership, and other things. Magesh, your point of view?
Sure. Thanks, Anand. So I would like to, kind of address this, from two ways. One is I want to continue my comment on vision, right? So in order for us to start, I think we need a very strong vision. So what should that vision look like? In my point of view, I think a manufacturing enterprise and a manufacturing journey in India will only be able to succeed if we think comprehensively. That means a vision should be, how do we go from sand all the way to the brand? And what does sand to brand approach imply? It means that right from silica, which we have in abundance, we need to start making the semiconductor design and semiconductor chips so that intelligence can be embedded within India at the crypto level, right? So we start at the crypto level, the silicon base, and in future we will have a graphene, and we can use graphene as well for developing semiconductors and intelligence, embedded intelligence, and system on chips and software on chips. So from the SoC level, silicon and graphene based SoC level, all the way to electronic components which are embedded with intelligence at edge devices, intelligence, built-in intelligence of AI. And then we get into large scale manufacturing where you need to have systems, processes, people, subsystems, all of that designed for India, designed by India, and designed for the way that we can operate with all our culture and with all our constraints and the challenges that we face in various regions of India. So keeping this in mind, we design these things. And then we should be able to also create products which are of world standing. So make in India is one aspect, but made in India should be really global and world class. And how do we achieve that? So this is the kind of resolve made in Japan took after World War II. This is the resolve that Germany took after World War II. This is a resolve that North America took, Russians took. So if you want to say made in India and be proud of it, what does that demand? What does that take? What kind of dedication that take, effort and investment that does that take? And most of the time, it's not money. It starts with a clear vision and attitude. And right, as you rightly pointed, it starts with the culture that, we need to work for our country. We need to work together for upliftment of our country. That should be a single-minded focus. A single-minded focus for a sufficiently long period in time, which is at least one lifetime. Right? One lifetime of Japanese have contributed to Japan to where Japan is. One lifetime of Germans have contributed to where Germany is. One lifetime of English engineers and English leadership have contributed to where United Kingdom is. And so also in North America. So also in Russia. So very clear vision, sand to brand, dedicated people willing to work together. And nature teaches us what is called a swarm intelligence. And what is swarm intelligence? Look at the bees, look at the ants, look at everything that is very, very small but effective, thriving. They existed before human beings and they will continue to exist perhaps after human beings. And how does swarm intelligence work? So even though there are very small creatures in the universe, they combine their brain activity and they work together. And they synergistically achieve the complete state of a large organism such as a human being, right? That's how bees and ants and everything that you see in nature, microscopic in nature, survive. They thrive and they use swarm intelligence. So why can we not use swarm intelligence or our own self-awareness, combine our self-awareness with a very strong vision? And as Deepak San and you mentioned, make sure that our culture is all about collaborating and working together. Because we are a young political entity, only 73 years old. Same thing happened to Germany. 1871, Germany, before 1871, there was no German Empire. It was just simple principalities and districts and provinces working in a federal structure within Europe. After 1871, you have the German Empire coming into being, and then the evolution or the Industrial Revolution in Germany started. They learned a lot from UK, from United Kingdom, and then they beat UK in every possible way in terms of innovation, in terms of culture, in terms of quality. And now Germany is at the forefront of Europe and definitely in the forefront of the world in many, many ways, which we can acknowledge, right? The Japanese were inspired by the English and the Germans. The Koreans were inspired by the English and the Germans. The Chinese were inspired by the English and the Germans. So all of the industrial revolution and manufacturing expertise and modernity that we see today and take for granted, this came from somebody deciding in one country that they will make their country successful. And this is what we must do. For India, as Indians, but it requires dedicated lifetime commitment
Yes,
with a clear
yes,
vision.
yes, yes. That's very inspiring, Magesh. It's very inspiring. And the thought that it brings up in my mind that all these examples that you shared of Korea, of Germany, and Japan, Deepak San has been talking about that. Now, these developments and reformations came from areas of pain. What I mean by that is that there were wars first, and then there was an era of humiliation, so to speak. Let's say in the case of Germany as well as China, they call it the century of humiliation. So these attempts or endeavors to transform came from a deep place which drove an entire nation. So, in that sense, what has been India's boon or fortune could have turned it into a curse, so to speak. That we have been, mildly, reasonably doing well in the last 73 years, and the droughts and famines have been a thing of the past, thanks to, as you mentioned, the Green Revolution and the White Revolution. Now, the thing is, that brings me to the second point of having a unified vision for a nation. So one thing is, as I said, the problem in India could be that uh, that thing has to come from a leadership drive, not from a place where we feel that okay, we have to do this further. So a nationalistic vision needs to come in from a leadership rather than the circumstances, is what I'm trying to get at. The second point that I need you gentlemen to address is that see. In today's era of globalization, it is very difficult to say that let's look inward. And this is how it is taken when people talk about make in India or make in Japan or a nationalistic vision. It is taken that it is paradoxical to a vision of globalization that the millennials in particular have been used to the last 20 years. So it is far more difficult for today's leaders to say that let's have a nationalistic vision when everybody is globally connected and hyper connected. So that is the second part of the problem. One is obviously that we have been well to do reasonably comparatively, and the other is the globalization and whether it is paradoxical to a nationalistic vision. So I'll come to you, Deepak San. That is that a problem today of having a national vision for industries particularly?
Uh, as far as my personal view is concerned, I believe that nationalism is required to unify the country, and especially when you know that you have potential to grow, then why you have to be dependent on other manufacturing hubs for importing anything? Because uh, as a country, now everyone realizes that we have a lot of potential. We have all the natural resources available, but still, when we talk to Indian distributors or suppliers, they still prefer to buy things from China. I mean, there is nothing against China, because China made itself capable enough that it become the global manufacturing hub. So idea is that India has potential to grow many-fold in terms of manufacturing. Then why and where it is lagging? That is a big concern for us. And
That's true,
further,
Deepak San.
yeah.
So the thing is, in the entire value chain of manufacturing, you need to have products and technologies from countries who are already ahead in certain areas, like let's say Japan and South Korea in processing, for instance. So how can we not depend on other countries for let's say commodities and other things in between?
Yeah, initially you definitely for technologies, because technology is something like where you have to keep yourself upgraded all the time. And nowadays, when we are heading towards a new age of technology, we also have to upgrade our knowledge in that way. So that is needed. So I mean that controlled nationalism is required, so that that keeps us motivated in terms of growing ourselves. But obviously the technological transfer, you have to identify to whom you should tie up with, who could be your potential partners. All these are, I mean, from the international business point of view, these things are needed. And in the prevailing scenario, when we say that we have to focus on manufacturing, then we cannot say that we will import from China, because China product is very cheap. That shouldn't be the case, because when we understand we can be self-reliable, so we should push little bit for the growth of our economy, and that's why controlled nationalism is needed Obviously,
Okay.
I'm not against globalization, but even Japan grew because Japanese said that I'll buy only made in Japan product.
Okay. Fair enough. Fair enough. Now that brings us to the. But let Magesh address this point as to why these paradoxes between nationalism and globalization, and how can we have a unified vision in today's day and age?
See, in my viewpoint, Anandji and Anand-san, is that everything in the universe happens in stages, right? Whereas, if you look at uh, the evolution of how we got here, it is all a very extremely long drawn, process of billions of years. Now, in this scenario, when we talk about industrial revolution, it is merely 2.5 or 3 centuries even, right? And within this 2.5 3 centuries, human beings have discovered things which allow them to amplify their thoughts into matter, and at an extremely fast pace. Now, as a geopolitical paradigm, there are 200 countries in the world, right? And these 200 countries have established their own political sovereignty and their own governance systems, so on and so forth. And at some point, we all had to come together post World War, and then the United Nations was formed, and then came World Trade Organization. So the word globalization came into being with the advent of World Trade Organization, and after 91, when we opened our gates and killed the license Raj, period of India's evolution, we started to see, that there are a lot of companies around the world light years ahead of us, because from 1947 to 91, we were living in the license Raj, era. Therefore, we really lost a lot of time, and we lost a generation of people who never had the capability to compete at the global scale, right? We only were available to the agenda that was being published within the license Raj, and that agenda was serving not necessarily all of democratic India. It was a very narrow vision, and that narrow vision is what allowed us to break through and create the opening of India in 1991, right? But all of us know what a struggle it was to achieve that. Even 1991, what a political struggle it was. So point over here is, we have lost a lot of time. Of the 73 years, we've lost a lot of time. Now, since 91 till 2020 is a very small amount of time to compete with all the advanced nations in the world with the resources that we now have. And that is where the issue of globalization versus, national interest comes into being. So you have to allow India, first off, you have to allow India to be able to crawl before it can stand up and run. We are at a stage where we are still crawling. So we need to build our people. There is millions of people below the poverty line, which basically means there is no way, there is no guarantee they would get a square meal of food on that particular day for them to survive, right? Even in our own agrarian economy, we have, a lot of people giving up their life because the agrarian economic activity is not viable, right? So there are so many challenges that we have to address. And while addressing these challenges, we cannot afford to get distracted. So what we need at the moment, as Deepak San mentioned, is we need to have the spirit of India. Whether you call it nationalism or whatever label you give, that is not something that I'm interested in discussing. I'm interested in discussing what's the vision for my country. Am I willing to dedicate my lifetime? I am. I'm walking the talk. And in order to do that, from the government point of view and from the external environment point of view, as a democratic nation, what are the linkages? What are the catalytic processes that catalyze such thinking, allow people to collaborate and synergize? That is what needs to be put in place. And in theory and in the books, all of that exists. But to execute it, you still need leaders. You still need the will. You still need the ability and willingness of people to work together. Because no amount of policy or vision can succeed if people decide not to work together. This is a fundamental fact. And there is a certain homogeneity of culture which people were able to achieve in Japan, Germany, UK, and other places where they succeeded. because everybody signed up to a particular spirit and said, yes, we will work for our country. So this is fundamental. And then when we succeed at this, yes, we are already in a global internet economy. That is but obvious. But as it is, you can see that there are many, many disadvantages of getting huge amount of unproductive misinformation, which is only taking us away from the main agenda of our own livelihood. It is distracting our young people. It is misguiding and in some cases also motivating them to do wrong things. So these are also the ill effects of the so-called globalization and the internet global economy that we live in, or the global world that we live in. So there's always two sides to every scenario, and it's not a matter of which is right. It's a matter of finding the balance and relevance and what is productive and allows us to move forward as a nation.
That's so true. That's so true. Especially your point about millennials and the young people being affected by what is happening globally, whether it is from authentic sources or not. And you have the Facebooks and the Googles of the world, where there are no checks and balances or barriers for the wrong information to come in. But that is why talks like these are so important. Webinars and podcasts that have suddenly cropped up in India during lockdown, that should have happened from way before. So I understand that when important issues such as these are left unaddressed by thinkers such as yourselves, then these areas are filled by memes and disjointed, incomplete ideas, which then are left for exploration by everyone. So this is why gentlemen such as yourself should speak more and more and fill these gaps. So because youngsters look for a very clear direction as they say in Hindi, ki batao bhi karna kya. But when they do not have any clear direction, a well-articulated vision, then they start to depend on these disjointed pieces of information, which is why these talks are so important. Now, I'll pick one thread from your point of view, Magesh, about the liberalization of the 90s, because we are following kind of a historical timeline as far as the agenda of this talk is concerned. Now, when liberalization happened, the aspirations were that we would be able to achieve double-digit growth and awaken the Indian tiger or Indian elephant, whatever metaphor are being attributed. And at the same time, in China and South Korea, in the 90s also, Deng Xiaoping, for example, started his own reforms. And they have raced far ahead and they were top driven. So whether it is South Korea's K-ball economy, I hope I'm pronouncing it right, where they called in the Samsungs and the LGs of the world. And they said that you build industries, you have a free hand. Or in China, which was also top driven, they started building the SEZs and the policies and all of that. But in India, that has lagged. So my question to you, gentlemen, is that all these countries started in the 90s, but these countries raced ahead. What were the reasons behind that, and how India can now catch up? I'll start with Deepak sir.
Actually, as you rightly said, that we opened up after 1990s, and I had mentioned that we predominantly looked ourselves as a service-driven economy. So at policy level, that was the huge mistake, I would say. And as I said, that we just started taking seriously about manufacturing activities only in 2012, when the previous government, they come up with the policy of national manufacturing policy. But problem is that even after 2012, when we envisioned that by 2022, our share of manufacturing in Indian GDP would be 25%, we are still standing at 15 or 16%. So obviously there is a problem at the implementation level, and that was not an issue in other countries like Taiwan, like Korea and Japan. Obviously, that is one of the problem area which we need to address. So in national manufacturing policy, I would tell you, I mean, I'm sorry, I'm taking you to a little bit microscopic analysis.
Please do. Please do.
it was planned that in India, to promote the domestic manufacturing, government identified the 13 locations across India to be developed as national investment and manufacturing zone. And the concept was that this zone will be primarily to cater the need of domestic demand, because for export we have SEZ. And the minimum area earmarked for the development of one NIMZ was 6,000 hectare. Now here the problem starts, because that was the precondition. So still, I don't think even a single NIMZ has been completely developed, only because of the land acquisition issue. Then we also came up with the policy, we call it as electronic manufacturing policy, EMC. I think that policy also came during 2012, 2013, because we realized that India should not be dependent on importing electronics, because especially the demand will go manifold by 2020. So they came up with the electronic manufacturing policy, and they were planning to start the local production of electronic components and electronics. But along with that, there was a policy introduced by the government, that a special incentive package scheme, because you cannot manufacture electronics without having semiconductor units. That is the essential part of developing the electronic industry. So these two policies came up. Policy wise, it was very good, but when the implementation happened, we had no industrial land. Land acquisition couldn't be finished on time.
Wow.
So implementation got delayed, and also the approach was wrong in terms of creating the manufacturing infrastructure. So if we, in today's time, if we see who are our competitive nations, then we look at Vietnam, because they are also a developing nation. We look at Indonesia. This is another developing nation, and they are one of the major manufacturing players emerging in global scene nowadays. What differently they did and what India couldn't do is that these countries, they first built up the infrastructure. They acquired the land, they created the whole infrastructure, then they went ahead with the promotion to the Japanese company, to the Korean companies, and the European companies, that infrastructure is ready, you please come and occupy the land. But in India, everything we plan after selling the land, and land itself is not acquired. So this is one of the biggest concern from the point of view of Japanese industries to get into the Indian market, because India, we say it has a huge potential to grow as an economy, because we are the youngest population. 65% of our population is between the age group of 15 years to 45 years. So obviously this is a consumer segment, so which will grow in due course of time. But still the market volume is low if we compare to the global scale. So we should think something out of the box to give an opportunity to the companies that, see, we have a ready-made infrastructure available, and then only you can come. Because in India, it's completely reversed. We wait for companies to come, we sell land, and then we don't know when the development will happen. So that is what is most important at this point of time, that where the business sentiment is all-time low. You have to think out of the box. You have to create infrastructure first. Then only you can invite companies, global companies, to get investment into your country.
Wow. Wow. In those 5 minutes, Deepak San, you highlighted all the critical issues, most of them as far as I'm concerned, as to what has held India's manufacturing vision back in terms of the policies that could not help us rise up to the growth curve of semiconductors, which is such an important piece of the whole puzzle. The semiconductor industry, right? I mean,
Yes.
Japan and South Korea, the main reason why these countries, Germany and the US, of course, are so far ahead in the high-tech manufacturing space is because of this piece of the puzzle, where we could not keep up, we could not keep pace. And you spoke about the reforms in the business sector. Wow, these are such important points. So, Magesh, what is your take, and what do you want to add to this perspective?
So I want to bring in some examples of India's excellent track record in providing indigenous milestones in the region of defense, or perhaps self-defense. So, people like great leaders like APJ Abdul Kalam, right, and Vikram Sarabhai, and so many other leaders made things happen which were considered as impossible in their time. It were considered as impossible when people were dreaming of indigenous technologies for self-defense of India. Impossible scenarios were put forward, and never did anybody realize, nor did they have the conviction that these people will achieve it. But we have achieved it, right? And if you take that as an example of what India can do and how India can organize itself towards self-reliance, when our mission and vision is crystal clear and the dedication of leaders is available, leaders who are willing to pioneer in areas where everything seems to be working against India, where there are very few partners who are willing to support India. This is exactly the kind of scenario we are in terms of manufacturing as well. So some of the barriers we have created ourselves, some of the barriers are existing because of our place in the competitive landscape of other developed nations, right? So how do we address the barriers that we have created for ourselves? So just as Deepak San explained, this is a real case study. It's a live case study of what the government decided to do as a policy measure, but failed to achieve. So the story is again a story of no available leadership, consistency of execution. There is not one champion who is taking on a particular cause and then doing that for 20, 30, 40 years. And this is the reason why we accomplish things when people like leaders like APJ Abdul Kalam came in and they achieved that in their field, and they achieved that outstanding status for India in their field, but they dedicated their life for that. So this is what is required for us to move forward, in my opinion. Very strong vision, definitely an ability to bring in leaders who have that vision and the power to execute. And leaders' job is to create more leaders. Leaders' job is not to create followers, right? A nation can only grow and the world can only grow if leaders create more leaders. So how do we foster that? How do we foster that culture? And how do you make that happen? And there are so many countries around the world where young people have to go and serve the army for 1 year, 2 years, whatever it may be. And how does that help the nation? Because it converts people from pure theoretical knowledge to actual practical skills, survival skills, training skills, living skills, and then skills to serve their country, right? There are many countries around the world with such a system. So what systems do we have to convert our young people who have just theoretical knowledge? And today it's even getting worse with just WhatsApp University and Google University, right? People have very limited superficial understanding. And then with that superficial understanding, they are trying to plan their future. So where are we heading? It's, we have to give a pregnant pause to where we are. And thanks to the pandemic, it's the ideal scenario to reflect where exactly are the young people of our country heading, right? Where are they spending their time? So the human capital element is extremely important for any of us to succeed in the manufacturing endeavor. So for example, I'll give an anecdote. In 1979, in Germany, when everybody decided that made in Germany has to be a fantastic number one label in the automotive business, right? So companies like Daimler, Bosch, and all other big companies came together. They invested and created technical institutes. They created training institutes called Duale Hochschule, where people can study theory, but at the same time practice their trade, practice what they're learning in theory. And that is how they created the dual system of education. And from the dual system of education came few thousand trained tradesmen who became the future leaders of the German automobile industry and other manufacturing enterprises within Germany. And if you look at the German economy in manufacturing, predominantly the lion's share goes into family-owned businesses and SMEs. which have been carrying on their businesses for over a century. The grandfather started it or the great grandfather started it, and now the younger generation is carrying forward their business, carrying forward their technology business. And a lot of it involves manufacturing. Whatever started as cottage industry is world-class manufacturing today. So we have to imbibe the lessons that we have gained from countries which are willing to support India, and accelerate that process with our own internal facilitations, in terms of education, in terms of healthcare, in terms of the land laws, such as what Deepak San mentioned, the constraints in acquiring land, and setting up large scale manufacturing units. And also we need to think of how do we bolster our cottage industries. India has a huge potential in making sure that the cottage industries which can be created in the villages of India, which already exist in the villages of India, how do we make sure that these cottage industries can achieve world class qualities, how they can innovate on a world class level. So these are all opportunities that can only be done provided we work on a clear vision, and that clear vision should be long term oriented.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's very well articulated, Magesh. Now, speaking of leadership, and we've been talking about leadership as to how it can set a vision, how it can get in the proper requisites for fostering a manufacturing movement. Now, with leadership, that we can, one, look for those leaders who are there, who have risen uh, up the ranks, and then rally around them and make them see how and why it is important for India's manufacturing to leap forward. And that has been happening in the last, let's say, 15, 20 years. And that is also the reason why we have a campaign like Make in India, as Deepak San so rightly mentioned, that even before that, we had the industrial policy that brought in such vision. Now, at our individual level, because every time such discussions happen, we speak about things that can happen at a larger level. But as Mahatma Gandhi said, that be the change that you want to see in others. How can industry stakeholders start this change from their individual level is what is also important to know. So, Magesh, can you comment on this? Should we be looking for how leaders should be able to drive this movement forward, or could we also start this change from ourselves, from the company where we work and the colleges where we teach?
Sure. So I think now that we are entering an abnormal or new normal phase in the world, post COVID-19 situation, we all have a wonderful opportunity to reset the way things have been working, right? So suddenly everybody in the world has become sensitive and aware that nothing lasts forever. Point number one. And point number two is that unless and until you work together and collaborate, the chances of survival are very, very minimal. And if you want to thrive in this world, which is, in my opinion, a VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, you have to be able to collaborate and work through the strengths of each other. Now, in the Indian context, what does this mean? What can we do today? What can we do now? Now, there's a lot of wonderful examples that emerged from corporate India, from individual selfless people, from a lot of startup entrepreneurs. Everybody started to work together in the pandemic. Everybody did their little bit. Everybody's doing their little bit, right? So that sense of contribution is needs to be carried on. That sense of participation in the community, for your country, for where you live, for your world. If you look at yourself as a world citizen living in India, and then seeing what you can do in your own community that you live in and exist in, those kind of thinking and those kind of actions coming from that kind of thinking will always be fruitful, will always be well guided. Now, in manufacturing enterprises, right? So there is a whole situation that is come about today where the existing manufacturing enterprise themselves are not able to bring in everybody into the factories to be able to manufacture, because now you're in a pandemic scenario, right? So this again should give us enough catalyst to innovate, bring out our Indian ingenuity. How do we continue to grow by keeping people safe, but at the same time making sure that our productivity keeps increasing? So this is what we need to deliberate on. This is what we need to think on. In some ways, it is forced, but in some other ways, this can actually turn out to be a huge gift which has come to us. And now the entire world is on a level playing field because everybody has one solid universal constraint, and that constraint is called COVID-19.
Great answer. Now, the next question to you, gentlemen, is if we see India, we see that different parts of the country have different rates of development, and that brings into perspective what is being done better in some parts of the country and not. That could also help answer some of these questions. Like if you see South, you see states like Tamil Nadu and Karnataka that are way ahead in industrialization and economic development in many other states. So my question to both of you gentlemen is, what are the right things that these states have done in the past that can be emulated by other states? Deepak San, any views on that?
Yeah, I think every state has their own timing. And as far as Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, and southern states are concerned, I think since the beginning, only these states, they started, in a way, they were a little bit lucky also. Because as far as, for example, in Bangalore, when all the manufacturing activity actually started in India, all the defense-based public sector units were established in Bangalore. And Mysore Maharaja was very, very progressive in that way, in that thinking, that he even offered some of the lands free of cost to the industries. So in a way, Karnataka was lucky, and Karnataka was also lucky to have leaders like Vishwesvaraya ji, who said that industrialize or perish, because he understood at that point of time that until unless you industrialize yourself, you cannot survive into long economic game. So obviously, that advantage southern states used to have, and also the availability of natural ports, and these are the factors which contributed to the overall development of these economies. But now, if we see the economic development of India, it is primarily from the north side, then west, then again towards the southern side, Bangalore, Chennai. This belt is only developed. But if you go to eastern side, which is predominantly agricultural based society, states like Odisha, Bihar, Assam, West Bengal, these states, and even UP. So these eastern states are still agriculture based economy, and those areas somehow they miss this developmental opportunity. So now, as a government, the first priority should be a post COVID thing, that how economy can be decentralized, because a lot of labor workforce, they migrated from those states to western part of India, southern part of India. Now they are going back to those places. Now there will be a huge problem in terms of job availability. So you always have to have a decentralized approach. You have to develop the local industry. Now agriculture is a primary industry, but you have to develop the local agro industry also in all these areas, so that demand can be generated local. So that is a check and balance approach required uh, just post COVID scenario. The second scenario, equally, the industries in southern India will be impacted, because all those workforce has migrated back. They are not sure when they will come back and when the
Yes.
actual opportunity will come. Especially the business sentiment is too low, that even the in current scenario, the manufacturing industries are unable to manufacture the volume, even 10% what they used to manufacture before COVID situation came up. So when companies like Toyota, when there is no demand for vehicle, how will you revive the demand? Without demand, they cannot manufacture actually. So in the short term priority is that government has to do something to revive these demands. They have to incentivize the industry, also the consumer. So obviously, I mean, there was a problem with the policy level thing, that government focused more on more industrialized happened in southern states and northwest part of India, but East India was somehow missed. So we have to have a decentralized approach from now onwards. That is most important.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Magesh?
So I think, like Deepak San mentioned, it's one point that I want to expand on what he mentioned is the local agrarian economy. So one thing where India, despite the green revolution, we have a big gap is the amount of mechanization that we have in the villages. India has 6 lakh villages, 735 odd districts, and about 38 states and union territories today. So uh, while we have a plan for 100 smart cities, we should also have plan for smart villages. And the smart villages essentially means, number one, energy self-sufficiency. We can go the solar route, become self-reliant in providing energy to villages, and also mechanization to farmers. So mechanization in farming can lead to increase in productivity, and mechanization and using new technologies in making sure that whatever is produced on the farm in the village is stored before being transported, or is being sorted before transported, or is being kept in chillers and freezers before transported, can increase the value of the produce. So point number one is we need to focus on the local, district level, villages, and the strengths that each zone brings within India. How do we amplify that? We have all the information. However, there is very little execution in terms of mechanization and modernization of villages. We are still dealing with very basic things like providing electricity, right? So there's a big gap there, and contribution is definitely required by private players. In my vision, if every Indian millionaire, whether he's domicile or whether he's non-resident, if he can adopt one village, then we'll definitely be a very glowing economy within the next 10 years, because all our villages would become self-sufficient in their economic needs, and people will rise above the poverty line. This is point number one. Point number two is with regards, connecting the village population to the urban population. There has to be a balance, because at the moment, if we have all of the labor move out of the agrarian economy, which is 70% of what our population is, into the urban ecosystem, then how do we balance the urban problems that we are beginning to see in the large, 10 or 15 cities of India? And those problems are quite relevant, so I do not want to repeat them on this particular, talk. So we'll need to have a global vision, but that global vision needs to work for India. It needs to be global, and in the sense that it needs to bring global India to a global standard. We need to make sure that at the regional level and at the district and the village level, we utilize the strengths of each of the regions that exist, whether it is farming, whether it is farm mechanization, or even if it means there are certain natural resources available in certain parts of India, we need to utilize those natural resources rather than simply, take those natural resources and export it out to other countries for other countries to benefit by processing those natural resources, right? So those are some of the pointers that I would like to give with regards industrialization and manufacturing excellence for India.
Thanks. Thank you, Magesh. Uh, Now we just have about 10 minutes left, and we have time for, let's say, two more points to be discussed. So we'll quickly do that. The first thing is the migrant issue, or the migrant exodus issue that you touched upon. I think we could talk a little bit about how that could change the social, or particularly the economic fabric of our country, what impact that could have in the near term and the long term on our factories. So, do you gentlemen have thoughts on this particular issue? Deepak San, how do you view this whole scenario?
Yeah, I mean, in the short term, we have to see how situation emerges from now onwards, because many labor workforce, they have migrated to their native places. It completely depends upon where they are willing to come back or they are willing to stay back. If they are willing to stay back, then overall reform requires, and government has to consider the agricultural policy in that way. Because what will happen, the biggest problem in terms of agriculture in India now is that the average land holding is reducing day by day, and we don't have mechanization in place, as Magesh pointed out. And in order to go ahead with that, government has to have a very important policy reform in order to make the productivity of the agricultural society higher, and that will be the immediate requirement. But there is another point of view set up by mentioned by some of the other experts, that they said that they will come back when the situation becomes normal. But it completely is very difficult question to answer because we don't know how the situation will emerge.
Deepak
But
Sir, sorry,
sure,
but I can answer that question for you.
yeah,
Because I am a dyed in the wool migrant from that part of the country. And like any other good migrant in the initial days of Mumbai, I traveled in trains like the Shramik trains, and I come from the same part and I understand it a little bit. So the thing is that when something like this happens, and the migrant, obviously the first thought is to return back to the family, to the parents. And then when migrants see that the city is not has not been able to take care of them, not only in the short run but also in the long run.
mhm,
See, as long as there is some hope on the horizon, is able to live in the slums and these congested areas because everybody is looking for social mobility. But that when that hope crashes, when there are no helping hands, even at the policy level, there is no
mhm,
consideration, then something snaps inside. And it takes a lot of willpower for one to be able to migrate to another strange city without anything to fall back upon in the first place, when people take that first decision. But when this thing happens, then the whole will is impacted, is damaged in a big way. So to answer that point or address that point, I can tell you that they may return, but not in as great numbers as they left. So that is, I thought I would share the psyche of a migrant
yeah.
from my
So
perspective.
in that case, I think government should be ready for a very short-term overhaul of the entire policy. Some of the state governments, like UP and all, they said that they will expedite the pending infrastructure projects so that some demand can be generated for these labor workforce. That is what I feel is a short-term measure. But in
Correct.
long-term measure, we have to see that how those families can be accommodated in the long-term employment scheme. And after all, they are originally farmer class. So until unless you work out something really big to improve the productivity of the farm sector, things are not going to be good for Indian economy.
And their home states are, for some reason, or maybe good reason, taking this as a very optimistic view. So the home states are thinking that perhaps they could become the next Shenzhen, for example, with so many migrants on hand.
Yeah.
I don't know how misplaced that view is, but I will like to understand Magesh's view as well on this, the whole migrant exodus situation and its near-term and mid-term and long-term impact.
So, my point of view, I think India, like any other country, definitely has a lot of migrant workforce. And while this is a natural process of cross pollination of cultures and people movement, but in terms of economics and standard of living, let's clearly understand why do people move away from where they are? Why are they by themselves displacing from their place of comfort, from their ecosystem, and coming into a foreign area or a alien scenario, working under very, very severe conditions of poor health, poor hygiene, lack of safety, and definitely very, very low wage, right? So there is a disparity, and this is not I mean, no, there is no labor migrating because they are getting higher wage or higher pay. It is not that mindset. It is the only work they are able to get, right? And there is a very big difference in the wage level of somebody who is coming into, say, Bangalore or into Chennai or Delhi from a foreign city or from another village. What is the conditions under which they work? For what kind of a pay are they working? Is there any safety and security for these human beings? The answer at the moment is very vague. Nobody knows. And because of pandemic, now we suddenly realize in our cities and in our factories how many of this migrant workforce contributed to the entire machinery being moving on a day-to-day basis. And nobody really bothered about this until everything came to a standstill. Now we find it difficult to resume activities because now we'll have to provide safe, health insurance, health safety, a minimum standard of living, a minimum wage for them to come back and for them to become part of the value creation process in factories and offices and our taxi services and everything else that exists in the urban environment. So this is symptomatic of the fact that we continue to exploit people based on their weaknesses, and that is not a way any country can develop into a very balanced and stable country where human beings can be happy and there can be progress in the real sense, in the social sense that there's progress of the country. So we have to be extremely careful when we talk about migrant labor, because a lot of this migrant labor today is under severe exploitation of every single kind. And that is the reason, and that is what we were addressing as to how to uplift our villages, how to uplift the natural ecosystems from where people come. Yes, and despite of all of these improvements in the villages, yes, people will want to come and work elsewhere. But when they want to come and work elsewhere, they need to be able to they need to be avail of work in the same standard conditions that is available to a person domicile of that particular state. They should get the same wage, not a wage lower than the person domicile in that state. They should be able to stay in a safe place. There should be laws of the land which is protecting them as well, right? So all these factors at this moment are not well defined. In fact, a lot of them in terms of identification, in terms of their residential addresses, their communication, all of this is very gray at the moment. And that is what we need to fix if we want to move forward as an industrialized economy with global standards.
Wow, that's very in-depth and thought-provoking and very strong. Thank you for that perspective. Now, there were many points that needed to be discussed now that we have come to almost a close. And I also deliberately did not touch upon them because they need much more time to be discussed. These are big topics like the industrial ages and India's position on those timelines, as well as why Make in India could not do as it was expected, why it could not take off, and what can be done to make it more effective. These are the two important things that needed to be discussed. But then we needed to set the context of this entire conversation. I personally feel, although it had a shaky start thanks to me, but the conversation warmed up, especially towards the middle and the end, and lots of insights came up. I'm really glad that this is being live streamed on YouTube, so it will be there at least till YouTube exists. And I'll personally be able to return back to this for insights that were shared today. I'm very grateful to you, gentlemen, who have taken time. And I really wish and hope that this conversation continues, particularly with you two, if possible, if your schedule permits, as well as with other stakeholders, right-thinking individuals in the industry, such as yourself. This is a very important piece of the conversation that needed to happen and was not happening for some reason. These are very basic points that people are chary to touch upon because they bring up so many political and social and economic and passionate issues that everybody starts to, becomes a war room when people start to discuss these things. whether it is personal or public forums. And the way this conversation was conducted is very inspiring to me personally and to our viewers. Thank you so much, Magesh. Thank you so much, Deepak San. We hope to continue this conversation. Anything,
Thank you so much for having us.
any point you want to add in order to wrap up today's discussion? Parting message for today's conversation that you want to share with our audiences? Let's start with Deepak San and then we go to Magesh.
Yeah, I mean, I'll talk more in terms of business, and there are many queries coming in from all business segment that post-COVID, how the Japanese companies will behave, whether they will shift out of China, whether they will invest more in India. So just to brief them about our discussions with the government, that we have requested government and we have told them that see the moving out from China is not going to happen, and India also cannot be a low cost mass production facility like China developed itself. Now at this stage that is not possible because demand is all time low. So India should always look at the R&D driven manufacturing capabilities, and they should try to promote such capabilities in due course of time. And for that, we have requested certain sets of demand to the government to bring in more Japanese investments. And why I'm saying that, we know that there are, we did the survey to all the Japanese companies in India, and luckily almost all the companies responded that whatever investment plans they have for India, they are not deviating from that. They will stick to that investment plan, and that is good news. I want to share with our viewers that Japanese companies will keep on investing in India because we are the natural partners, and the partnership will be a win-win situation. So even though market sentiment is all-time low, we will see the upsurge in Japanese investment in coming years, starting from this fiscal year itself. So any query, if they have any support, all the participants they require from JETRO's point of view, we are there to assist them. So at later stage, you can share my email address and phone numbers to them. Thank you.
Thank you, Deepak. That inspires hope. Magesh?
I have only one message to everyone listening, and my single message is that please have a vision for yourself, and make sure that in that vision there is something that you can do for your country. It's the need of the hour, and I think the COVID pandemic has opened many of our eyes, and hopefully we can learn, take the learning from it, from the situation, and bring about a better version of ourselves. Thank you.
Wise words. And on that note, we end this discussion. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for your time. Have a great weekend.
Thank you so much, Anand.